Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to KEI. For those of you whom I haven't met, I see some friends around the table, but also some new faces. My name is Kathleen Stevens. I am not the speaker today, but I'm the new president of KEI. In fact, this is my first week. I started on Tuesday. And it's both a pleasure and I think very appropriate that the first session I have the privilege of introducing is on something that may seem a little bit out of what we normally talk about at KEI, but I think is actually right at the very center of the kinds of issues that are shaping the U.S.-Korea relationship in the 21st century. And that's, of course, the search for sustainable energy paths and the issue of trade and protectionism and so on, which is also very much in the news again these days. I was thinking about both that we talk to them in this kind of 21st century issues in the U.S.-Korea relationship, but in fact, for Korea, the search for energy has been a constant obsession, of course, still is in both South and North Korea. I have to tell an anecdote, of course. I first went to Korea in the 1970s when, of course, South Korea in particular really has very little fossil fuels, just a very low-grade coal. And I found out myself that when my one little piece of coal called Yantan ran out, that was it for the night. And I went back there a few years later. When I went back, I met some students. I was a Peace Corps volunteer and teaching, and our classroom was so cold. He said, we had a little stove that never had wood. He said, we used to take pieces off the desk and burn it only when the teachers weren't looking. So the search for sustainable energy has been an important part of South Korea's success. It's also an important part of, North Korea's difficult journey. But that's another story for other KEI sessions. But renewable energy has also always been, I think, an important thing in Korea and increasingly in the U.S. Again, I remember in the 1970s meeting a North Korean refugee living in the hills of South Korea. This is really true. Sometimes Mark Twain says, as I get older, I have increasingly vivid memories of things that never occurred. But I remember this old man he wasn't so old. He was probably about 45 years old. But he was there in the mountains and he was trying to come up with solar energy for his house in the hills. This is in 1975, so he was ahead of his time. But Koreans are good use of renewable energy. This is my renewable wind energy I used to walk to work today, and I tell you, it really works. So I'm looking forward to this discussion. It's obviously an issue of huge economic and social importance for both our countries and for the world. I guess my final kind of observation in terms of just thinking about these issues is I was looking at the latest edition of Harper's. The first page, they sort of have interesting little facts, and there was something about Korea. And it said in a recent poll in Korea, they love polls, right? The issue, it was asked, what are South Koreans most anxious about? What do they worry most about? And we all have some ideas about that. But actually, North Korea was number 6, which of course surprises, I think, most American audiences. What was number 1? You might say it was education. It was pollution. So I think that's another important part, and I don't know if we'll get to that today exactly, of this focus on renewable energy. But I'm glad, again, we're discussing this. We're very happy to have Jun Park here, who's done some really interesting work on it. I'm very much looking forward to hearing about it, but I want to turn it over now to Kyle Ferrier, who's our Director of Academic Affairs here, to introduce Jun.
Thank you, Ambassador Stevens, for those opening remarks. I am someone who studies international political economy and work on Korean issues, and as I try and pursue that field, I increasingly find that there are very few people who do that, and I'm actually very happy to have someone else who works on those issues here today, sitting to my left, Jun Park. She's a research fellow for Northeast Asia at the Seoul National University Asia Center in Korea. She's actually a recognized up-and-coming young scholar, being recognized by the Asia Society, and also, I don't see it in here, but back in 2011, Jun was part of our Emerging Leaders special edition of our joint U.S.-Korea academic studies, and I'm going to slip in that the new version of our joint U.S. academic studies is actually just outside on the table, so please pick one up before you leave. We've got some great new essays in there. But without any further ado, I'm going to turn things over now to June to talk about her presentation and her research on solar power in South Korea's energy mix and the impact of global protectionism.
Okay. High technology now. It wasn't like this in 2011. So thank you so much for coming on this very hot day. It's not as hot as in Korea, but I can still feel the heat. And first of all, I'd like to thank Ambassador Stevens and, oh, I should call her now Director Stevens, right? And Kyle for inviting me to this wonderful event. Actually, Kyle visited Seoul the year prior, and we discussed, from scratch what we would be envisioning in this On Korea journal article. And I'm very, very honored and delighted to be part of the KEI publication business again. Back then, in 2011, I was working more on finance issues. So with regard to the macroprudential kind of strategies that South Korea was taking on after the global financial crisis. But times have passed. I defended. I'm a doctor now. And basically, through the 2-3 years post-PhD, I've been working a lot on trade and energy issues together. And upon encountering this safeguard, the 201 safeguard, I was thinking that we could try to connect how the solar energy industry is being connected in many ways, not just to the trade policy issues, but also in terms of climate change policies. And it's worth taking a look at how this is played out in both policy realms. So I would invite you to think hard about this issue going forward. And maybe the findings right now are preliminary, but we will work towards a final publication this year. And I'm hoping that you would provide some food for thought at the end of the, or during the presentation. I don't mind, MIT style. If you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to ask as well. So I'm just going to jump in and some jargons before we begin. So anyone working on trade issues? Okay, so maybe not many trade people in the room, so I'm just going to explain what the hell trade remedy is. And solar PV, why we abbreviate it in photovoltaics, but yeah, we're just going to call it PV. Trade remedy in 3 major ways. There are 3 methods: anti-dumping, countervailing duty, and safeguards. And the case we're going to be talking about today is the safeguard, but basically anti-dumping is when a foreign entity, foreign country sells goods, their goods on your soil lesser than fair value. And when there is that activity, you sense it and you investigate it. And if there has been serious injury, you deploy tariffs, anti-dumping tariffs. And countervailing duty is when a foreign country tries to subsidize a certain sector, and by that margin, your industries get hurt, and you can basically deploy that tariff as well. Safeguard is basically a blockage to the foreign items that are hurting your industry when it has been proven through investigation. So those are the mainstream trade remedy tactics that we discuss. And in the solar case, the safeguard that has been placed is on Chinese and South Korean washing machines, as well as solar PV. And the solar PV that we're talking about here, I just wanted everyone to know that the cells and the modules and panels look different. So I just placed a picture here just in case, some people would get confused what modules are. So the very basic thing is the cell, and then when it's bundled up together to produce a certain amount of megawatt, then it's a module, and it gets bigger, and it becomes a panel. And it's a whole system that we can deploy in our households and in the back of our yards or or any kind of infrastructure that you would consider somewhere that has a lot of sunlight. In fact, at SNUAC, Seoul National University Asia Center, at the top of our roof, we have 4 panels. It's not even modules. We have 4 panels, and they're actually generating our shower facility hot water, and we are benefiting tremendously from those 4 panels. So here, so just to give you a very brief sense of how renewable energy is coming to our world, you could see in this very graph, on the right, I just wanted to portray, I'm not a scientist here, but I wanted to let you know how solar power is actually coming into our homes and our facilities. And on the left, you have renewable electricity capacity growth by technology, and you can easily see that solar power is basically the up and coming and very large-scale source of renewable energy that we see currently and into the future as well. Renewable capacity growth by country and region is a little bit diverse, and you could basically see that China has been it has been spearheading the whole process, mainly by its country subsidies on solar panels and solar technology. This has to do a lot with the NDRC's plan to sort of increase and also to increase electricity production as well as to diversify energy sources in China. And solar, the electronics production capability in China is immense in massive scales, and this really fit the bill. In contrast, we have some countries like the United States, the European Union, India, and some other countries. South Korea is not portrayed here, but Japan has very sophisticated solar panels, and some other countries, such as Brazil and some countries in Africa and the Middle East, are also in the process as well, especially Saudi Arabia and the UAE that want to deploy different kinds of energy sources because of the declining oil prices. Now, if you want to take a look at this cute panda over here, the Chinese power plants, solar power plants, are mainly in Datong in China, and they're all in very massive scales. They have plenty of land to do this. Also, in this picture right here, very big, right? South Korea is not at all close to this kind of luxury, and you could probably sense that when we talk about solar energy in South Korea, it's still pretty minimal. So let's discuss how it's different in South Korea. Let me just show you this before So China's share in global solar PV manufacturing and demand is basically soaring, but we will discuss more in detail what has been happening with regard to the safeguard, not just in terms of this general trend of increase. So overview-wise, the research question I had for this paper was why specifically the US safeguard on solar panels would propose challenges for South Korea's renewable energy policy, specifically why. And the argument that I'm trying to portray here, deliver here, are 2 things. One is the impact on South Korea's solar panel production and exports. We will see this towards the end of the presentation. And the other thing is the complication with Moon Jae-in's renewable 30-20 policy. I am not sure why it's called 30-20 when the projection date is 2030. Do they want to do things like in a unique way? Japan has the same sort of, naming the policy 2030. So there could be some rationale behind this in terms of naming it differently from the Japanese, but I haven't been given a plausible explanation on this. So I will share with you some of the preliminary findings and offer my own policy recommendations. The argument, first and foremost, that I'm going to just throw at you right now is, so two main branches in the pillars in the paper. So impact on South Korean solar PV production and exports. First of all, the safeguard is basically blocking Chinese and South Korean solar PV entrance into the U.S. market. The only way for South Korean companies to keep on producing is to relocate their facilities here and avoid the tariffs. But there were expectations about the U.S. domestic solar panel rise right after the safeguard. And what they did in China and Korea specifically was decide to invest in the United States to move the facilities here. And then in June, what came about as part of the NDRC's decision was the cut of subsidies by China, which is very unusual, and it was coming with some kind of a bold decision within the Politburo, I think. And this led to massive amounts of solar panels onto the global market, which means that Chinese manufacturers want to get rid of their production. And at the same time, the EU has lifted, this is only 3 days ago, the EU has lifted its restrictions on Chinese photovoltaic. So what do we see here in terms of South Korea's positioning? The prices fall. South Korea is left with very minimal amount of choices. And the severe competition will persist because many countries are producing solar panels now. And by 2022, I think we would see mainly US, China, and India as the main competitors in terms of manufacturers. So there would be severe impact on South Korean, not just the big producer, Hanwha Qcell, but also small and medium-sized technology developers in the solar industry. Then the second pillar here is about the complications with Moon's renewable policy. When we discuss energy policy, there are three sort of components in constructing energy policy, and there is a trilemma in achieving this. Most developed nations usually try to achieve at most two of these components. The three of them are environmental sustainability and cost, and also stability. Stability meaning no cut in the provision of the energy supply. And for a heavily producing country like South Korea, stability of electricity is essential to its production. So when we think about the Moon administration's sort of overly ambitious goals toward pushing for renewable energy and trying to scrape off coal and nuclear, we're sort of at a loss as to how much of this is based on rational calculation and realistic projections about the future. Of course, renewable energy must be if it must be pursued in terms of energy diversification, especially for a country like South Korea. But at this moment in time, I think there is plenty of room to think about which, based on what scientific / calculation South Korea should pursue this path, and to what degree they should go ahead with this policy. So one thing related to the safeguard that I emphasized also earlier in my first pillar of the argument is the adoption of Chinese cells instead of South Korean cells post-safeguard. And this has been very prevalent, although the Ministry of Trade and Industry and Energy does not try to acknowledge this fact. The smaller firms are getting hurt by the government's decision to keep a budget on pushing for the renewable energy policy. And basically, they are not left with a policy choice, a good policy choice, either to export somewhere, the US market is blocked, so they either want to relocate their facilities or they want to sell elsewhere, but there's actually no real plausible solution for these industries. And then there's the issue of public opinion, which during the presidential election, there's been a lot of fear-mongering on nuclear power generation. Post-Fukushima, this has been evident for many, many countries, and South Korea was not an exception. So I'm going to go deeper into the safeguard here. And how much time do I get for this? 20 minutes, right?
You have about 30 minutes left.
Okay, enough. The U.S. safeguard based on Section 201 on the Chinese and South Korean solar panels. So if we look at this in history, the U.S.-China conflict is much more deeper and much more longer in history. So in October 2012, China already was slapped with anti-dumping and countervailing tariffs from the United States on solar. And this year, 2018, when the Trump administration deployed the safeguard on both South Korea and China, the real issue came about from this point on. But already the U.S. was engaged in a WTO dispute also with India. And the safeguard, as I would like to remind you, was not on just solar, right? It was also on washing machines. And South Korea has been in a WTO dispute with the United States from 2014. I believe that case has not yet been closed. So China has responded very fiercely. Sometimes the Chinese retaliation is manifested not in terms of the same commodity, but also in terms of a different commodity, and it was with sorghum. Then it was withdrawn during the talks in May. And ultimately, China filed for a WTO dispute on the safeguard a few weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago. And the South Korean case is a little bit more, I should say, more methodic. South Korea responded more in alignment with the European Union Commission on fighting these kinds of protectionist measures. Initially, this was like a political signing, sort of signaling effect. And then South Korea filed for the WTO dispute against the safeguard, specifically on this safeguard in May. So this is an ongoing case at the moment. I just want to point out that when you look at the U.S. imports, it does raise a lot of concern. If you look at the construction of imports, China and South Korea do take up a huge chunk from the U.S. perspective. And the projection that we had right after the safeguard was that there would be aggregate impacts into the next few years. And where you see the red arrow over here is when there was the safeguard deployed. And the projection was that basically the insulation would fall because tariffs would make solar installation very costly. And by segment, if you look by segment, you're looking at residential, non-residential, and utilities. But mainly in the US and as well as in Korea, there has been a lot of shift toward trying to plant residential PV in your homes and elsewhere in the yard and whatnot. This is an ongoing endeavor, specifically in California, the state of California, and I think there would be a little bit of a hiccup in this regard because of the safeguard. We have not shown the effects of the Chinese cut of subsidies yet in the U.S. market just yet, but the prices are falling, and we will soon see what kind of effects that would actually entail. Looking more closely at the energy mix and the energy trilemma. Oop, am I going ahead too fast?
Might have skipped. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Sneak previews.
Oh, maybe I should look over there. Okay. Oh, okay. So, going back to what we discussed about the trilemma here. So the trilemma is basically, again, the sustainability, cost, and stability of energy provision. And this specific graph and statistics are based off of 2015 figures. So this is before Moon Jae-in came into the Blue House. And South Korea generally has had a good score in terms of lessening the cost because it was running nuclear power plants. But as we go forward, if we're thinking about sort of foregoing nuclear power plants eternally for good, and if we're thinking about trying to come up with different energy resources to sort of replace or supplement it, I think Korea has ways to go in trying to establish a firm policy. And looking here, I will show you a more detailed a pie, but just for your information, South Korea is a very resource, not depleted, what's the word? Scarce country, and it's also depleting its sources, energy sources too. But basically, the fossil fuel reserves are not so much except for coal, and South Korea has relied heavily on gas, foreign imports of gas and oil in the past decades of industrialization. So that's quite important in understanding South Korea's needs in terms of energy. Based on the 2016 figures, we know very well that oil and gas take up a huge chunk of South Korea's energy consumption. And in the midst of all of this here, there are some renewables. And if you look at the following graphics, you can see that there's a little bit of a hiccup here. I'm very sorry, I could not fix the minus here. The renewables percentage of 4 is divided into biofuels that are actually not -1, but 0.8. Hydro and solar take up a little bit more of roughly around 0.8. And there are others, such as geothermals or waste biocombust, and wind, which is not permanently 0, but a little bit more than 0, so 0.2%. And solar energy generation from 2004 to 2016 is really looking more positively toward generation. But as you can see here, South Korean generation of renewable energy, in terms of which energy source, solar is looking good, but there are some other renewable energy sources that are not really stable in terms of its growth, and one of them is hydro. So, pursuing this policy of renewable energy, South Korea needs to think about the optimal sort of proportion and optimal ways of pursuing this tactic. It can't be just built on social philosophy or a certain siding on a specific energy source. It has to be thoroughly thought out and calculated toward achieving the best interest for South Korea. I'd like to step over a little bit more towards agenda setting and energy policymaking here. And here you see Moon Jae-in's campaign pledges. This is before he took office. And initially, I think the public that was given the idea that Moon Jae-in would basically close down all of the nuclear power plants and replace the nuclear power plant power generation with something else. And at the time, I think nuclear power plants were quite debatable because of the Fukushima disaster. And at the same time, people were very wary of nuclear power production. But at the same time, there were these concerns about micro dust. Is that how you say it in English? Yeah. So 미세먼지 in South Korean, Korean language. So I think the general public had a hard time to sort of grasp where was which factor leading to the health hazard, and sort of trying to think about whether nuclear power plants were there for interest or a certain benefit or actually a hazard. And there was a citizenry panel that was constructed after he came into office because there were so many different opinions about this. And I've had some friends who participated in the citizenry panel, and ultimately it was decided by that panel that nuclear power should be gradually decreased, and renewables and LNG would replace these kinds of fossil fuel. What he promises is more than that, actually. So this 30-20 policy goes a lot more further than just proposing hydro and solar, and it promises like the competitiveness of the renewable energy sector. And there are specific feed-in tariffs. These are sort of like long-term contracts that will be given to renewable energy producers in South Korea to promise a long, sustainable kind of a renewable power generation. And then there is also the support of R&D, which is proposed but not actually in effect just yet. And also, if you read the Renewable 3020 Policy Action Plan, the report's not there, but action plan is published, and they're proposing a massive deregulation to enable solar PV installations throughout the country, which was not really readily available before Moon Jae-in came into office. But the impact on the domestic solar industry proposes a grim picture with all of this in the background. If you look at this graph here, this is a bar graph. Basically, there are top 10 PV cell manufacturers, suppliers from 2016 to 18, and these figures have changed somewhat from 2015. In 2015, Hanwha Q-Cell, the company Hanwha acquired the Q-Cell company from Germany, and before that it was a German company, but now it's a South Korean company, and they decided to invest heavily into solar energy production, and they became very, very successful in conquering the global market. However, after the safeguard, this is a little bit uncertain whether they could keep their top spot. And by their announcement that they would relocate the facilities here in order to produce their cells, we have not seen any public announcement on their decision to keep that as a plan or to alter their plans. Because if Hanwha keeps on producing in South Korea, let's say they want to export their cells to a different country that would have some demand. And right now, all countries across Asia, including India and Malaysia, are interested in developing and selling solar power cells. So there is considerable competition. And for them to survive, they need to find a way in which their technology would be actually compensated with the right amount of price. So this graph may not be sustainable into the future after the safeguard. And what we have been witnessing post-safeguard, so this is only about a few months. So the safeguard was in January, and these are the figures just in the even months, so February, April, and June. And we are starting to witness that the cells that are being imported into the country are mainly Chinese cells, and there is not enough equivalent export going to China from South Korea, and this is a major issue here. The Ministry of Trade, Industry, and Energy explanation on this graph was that if you look at the figures starting from 2015, things are a little bit different, and South Korea has been deploying most of its own productions into South Korean installations. But we're looking at post-safeguard effects, and I think that's very crucial. Just to give you a little bit of sense of where the other countries are in terms of renewable energy, China is definitely the spearheader here, and also in this graph, China is leading the way. And if you look at South Korea's sort of public policy efforts against all of the Chinese competition, this is the Seoul city trying to deploy mini solar power plants here, and you just click on a district and you'd be able to see where what is located. And so I clicked mine. It's the Gangnam district, and you have many venues where you can find these mini sort of small scale solar power plants that are installed throughout. And my local library also has a solar power plant. The issue is where it actually comes from. This is also a sort of a public policy effort by the Seoul municipality in order to kind of attract basic consumers to install in their own homes or in their workplaces and whatnot. And they're explaining like a procedure where you could get some public government help with regard to the installation. And you have this very big installation in Yeongwol in Gangwon province, which is really grand scale. And this is fairly new. This is the bike lane that connects Daejeon City to Sejong City, and it's only going to be expanded in the coming years. But my question here is still, will those cells be actually South Korean technology? So just to wrap up before the sort of policy recommendations that I'd like to give, these are the recent developments in the global solar power game. And as I've mentioned, the Chinese withdrew, the NDRC laid out its plans in June, and the Chinese withdrew subsidies on solar starting last month. And the EU has, in response, lifted the restrictions on solar panels from China. Whether China's decision was basically based on the safeguard and whether it was domestically or whether it was a concerted effort domestically in order to sort of balance its own interests and to make the industries live on their own is still a question. There are different kinds of analyses coming out from both China and from the solar energy industry in general. But what's really clear right now is that for the South Korean solar panel producers going forward, these developments are not necessarily a good sign because, first of all, Chinese subsidies have been cut. The U.S. solar panel producers will be slightly in a sigh of relief because of this, but at the same time, South Korea has not found an exit with regard to finding alternative export destinations. It's still in a limbo in terms of how to go forward on solar panel solar industry within South Korea. Where is the direction? And even though renewables 3020 sort of proposes that solar and wind, hydro, they would be sort of the propellers of the renewables into the future, there is no clear-cut guideline yet specified by the ministry or the government. Perhaps we would see it into the fall, but we have yet to see it. So my final policy recommendations for South Korea here. First of all, the diversification of exports has to be conducted to non-US, non-China, non-India destinations, perhaps the Middle East. Japan has plans with Saudi Arabia to deploy solar power plants there. The Middle East would be a very suitable place to install solar panels because of the weather and the climate. The relocation of production facilities by big producers such as Hanwha Qcell would be unavoidable. But if and when the WTO dispute results are not very good, especially in this WTO stalemate when the US is trying to block the appellate judges from being hired, for SME producers, they would be caught in this limbo. And if R&D is to be government subsidized, then they have to be supported on what their niche could be with regard to vis-a-vis Chinese, Japanese, Indian panels. And they should be protected of their IP, intellectual property. On the South Korean energy mix and renewables, balancing this trilemma is very important, and the reconsideration of the energy sources would also be vital. I will not advocate for nuclear power generation per se, but it is certainly one aspect that South Korean officials may want to think about. Then there is this deregulation of installation laws. Of course, they are necessary, but there has to be some conduction of a thorough analysis, cost and benefit analysis for the installation. And there must be an institutional sort of mechanism for resolving the disputes on over the quality of the solar panels installed or produced or bought. There are many disputes on the rise amongst the public with regard to solar panel installation because the government is pursuing this so much, and people think that they can save much based on their installation. Either they do it themselves, they hire an entity to do it, but there are legal sort of claims on the rise, and there has to be some regulatory or sort of dispute settlement kind of mechanism that has to be installed in South Korea. So I'll stop it there, and I would welcome your thoughts, comments, or opinions on this very important topic. Thank you.
Thanks, June, for that very informative presentation. You've given us a lot of time, a lot to think about. Also, a lot of time to think about it when we get into the Q&A. But before we get into it, I just want to point out you had the picture of the Kung Fu Panda in the Chinese countryside, and as a comparison to the Korean countryside, I know they don't have one made out of solar panels, but they have one in the countryside in Chungcheongbuk-do of Kung Fu Panda made out of rice paddies. So a side-by-side comparison between Korea and China, and at least in relation to where they are on solar panels so far. But to get back to some of the questions and concerns that you raised in your presentation, I just kind of hinted around it the entire time. And Korea has always sort of been a net importer of energy, as Ambassador Stevens has also pointed out. But why is it so important in terms of solar energy for Korea to really develop its own domestic industrial market? Why is it so important for them to not rely on Chinese competitors or Indian competitors? Because as far as what you showed in your presentation, that there just really isn't a big domestic industry in Korea yet, at least comparatively to some of what the other countries have. So how important is it really in the grand scheme of things for these SMEs, these smaller companies who develop these, or Hanwha, not necessarily an SME, but some of these smaller companies in Hanwha and maybe some other that's able to actually have a stronger threshold in the Korean market?
Well, I think, so the normative kind of explanation to this is that, okay, South Korea does not have a lot of resources to begin with. Unification and getting all that minerals and whatnot would be another sort of option to explore, but that's really not the realistic agenda, right? I mean, at this point. And for a country that doesn't have many resources, I think first and foremost, you need to think about how to diversify your sources, where to get it from, at how much of cost. And solar within the renewable sector for South Korea, compared to geothermals, for example, has much more sort of prospect that it could carry on if it develops very sophisticated and concrete technology that could be good for the public. At the same time, South Korea can't just rely on nuclear, can't just rely on gas or oil into the future. It needs to keep thinking about different strategies, and solar is definitely one of them. But how to do it right is, I think, the core question. And yes, you would want some solar panels to save on electricity, that is for sure, clearly. But at the same time, to what extent is more viable for South Korea? Let's say, for example, South Korea doesn't have all the sunlight during the winter, right? It's not Saudi Arabia. It is not the United Arab Emirates. So for South Korea, I think it's really important to think long and hard about what is possible for the country and how much would be acceptable.
And going back to one of your earlier charts, and just looking at it right here, you have renewables are at 4%. So they're trying to increase that, and by the share that you have later on in the pie chart, it trying to make it a much, much larger percentage. And so essentially it has to eat away at nuclear and coal for the most part. Nuclear is they both have different political hang-ups. Nuclear because of Fukushima, as you mentioned, coal because of the particulate matter, the floating things floating in the air. But you also sort of pointed out there that they're more they're necessary, and they may be a little bit more intractable on the economic sense. But one thing that I see over here is the gas. It doesn't necessarily have as much political baggage. And I was just wondering, to what extent do you see gas as sort of being a middle ground moving forward until we get to the point, or if we ever do get to the point where we would have solar take up, or renewables, not just solar, take up a much larger chunk of the South Korean energy mix?
Well, so as far as for gas, I think it's a completely different ballpark there. There is also a severe competition ongoing since the shale gas revolution. I have a different strand of research just specifically on gas with regard to the downfall of prices. Previously, oil and gas used to be coupled in terms of their price ranges. Now, so many players are supplying gas, not just the Russian pipeline gas, but U.S. shale gas. There are the Qataris, Australians. China also has shale gas. They're just not selling them. Into the future, I think China will conduct its sales. But what's really going on about gas in terms of the South Korean market is that LNG proposes something, not just in terms of sort of symbolization with regard to those micro dust or sort of pollution in general. What it proposes is the image of a clean energy source that is deployed by many industries within South Korea that are favorable to the use of liquefied natural gas. Now, this dynamic is shifting very, very fast in the gas market because with the U.S. shale gas provision to Asia, the U.S. has long-term contracts with Japan, with South Korea, with also China. All of this happened during the Trump administration. South Korea has tried to sort of appease the U.S. on trade deficits by deploying more gas, natural gas from the United States. But not just about this trade conflict going on, it's also about how much this positive image of liquefied natural gas and possibly Russian pipeline natural gas that comes into South Korea, it just proposes something that's not coal, not oil. And people are interested in trying to see LNG expand a little bit more into their lives. Now, with regard to the renewables, I think LNG is not actually a renewable source of energy, and it will definitely compete with the renewable energy sources. But there is this political game going on in terms of gas with the possible construction of an LNG transaction terminal, more of an LNG regional hub that doesn't exist in Asia at the moment. Singapore is trying to build it. Shanghai is trying to build it. And Shanghai, in the longer term, I think China will try to come up with a commodities market where gas is traded mainly there. Then the consumers, such as Japan or South Korea, will have to conduct their transactions there as well. But what's happening after the shale gas revolution is that there are spot markets that are created, and South Korea has to benefit from that kind of change. But rather, it is still conducting long-term contracts. The Qatari and Australian, Malaysian contracts would expire for Japan and South Korea in the coming 2 or 4 years. And who will acquire that chunk of long-term contracts is essentially the issue. I think many of the LNG terminals that are being opened in the United States are all eyeing those two countries. So that would be the comparative aspect with regard to renewables and gas.
There it goes. Thank you for those answers. We'll turn things over now because I can keep asking questions, but I figure we can turn it over to the audience, let somebody else get a chance. We have some mics floating around. If you could just raise your name, say your affiliation before asking your question. Yes, start over here.
Hi, thanks for an excellent talk. I'm John Burton with the Korea Times. Just following up on the LNG issue. As you know, they're very deep LNG markets, and by that I mean very flexible spot markets in the US and Europe. And one of the complaints about among Asian importers of LNG is that they seem to be tied to these long-term contracts that you were mentioning. Do you see any movement in the region to develop these spot markets, more deeper financial markets, quicker, that would bring down the price? Or do you think Asian LNG importers are basically boxed into long-term contracts?
Should we collect or? Yeah, okay. To give you a very short answer from my perspective, I think politically the long-term contracts cannot be forgotten. I mean, it's just a political tool for countries like South Korea and Japan to keep on maintaining their relationships. For example, Qatar would not be happy if Japan continues to pursue US shale gas and Australian gas. They've also threatened Japan that Japan would not be able to experiment on its fields if Japan continues to pursue different sources. South Korea may be met with a similar kind of a sort of situation. And for that reason, I think politically, these two countries, having mainly the same kind of construction of energy sources, they keep on relying on these long-term contracts. At the same time, there is this trilateral movement going on. Sort of during the Park Geun-hye administration, KOGAS really tried to kind of construct a consortium between among China, Japan, South Korea to consume LNG in the most optimal way possible. But it was only an MOU. It's a political move. And Japan and South Korea have already sort of failed, or their agendas have failed. Sort of disappeared on building a physical or virtual LNG trading hub. If you talk to the Japanese officials, they'll still say that it's still on. But from the South Korean side, I think the South Koreans are just looking at maybe Singapore or Shanghai to construct the terminal and also create the market, virtual market. So these long-term contracts will still exist, even though there are spot markets on the rise. Spot market, I think it's about 25% of the market currently. And especially if the US tries to sell more through opening different kinds of terminals. Of course, they're not only intended for South Korea or Japan, but they will be in a political bind, just as the Middle Eastern ones were. And for if we talk more broadly in the sense of geostrategic kind of perspective, I think with with the Belt and Road Initiative and South China Sea issue sort of unfolding, that maritime route can not always be guaranteed for good. So South Korea may try to explore more opportunities in the United States, and that probably is not the end of the long-term contracts. More questions? Yes. Yeah.
James Sang, retired. You mentioned that the North Pacific is not the greatest place, or not the obvious place for solar power. On the other hand, Korea has a lot of shoreline. You indicated that Korea has very little wind installed right now, although the plans for 3020 have a fair amount of wind. What has determined Korea's attitude toward wind power, renewable?
Wind, I haven't done specific studies on wind per se, but it is the second, sort of, from the Moon Jae-in administration's perspective, it is the second largest or more promising renewable energy source that they can depend on. What is not really promised, though, we have seen the graphs earlier on in the slides, but there are fluctuations in the wind production as well. They are looking at offshore wind installations, but I'm not sure as to, okay, so compared to a really stable supply, what can that promise? And if you install wind and solar together, and if you try to sort of put that at the front of your energy policy, can you really depend on those two eternally, is the question that I'm throwing. Nuclear energy, on the other hand, has all of these people are nervous about the subject itself, and therefore the citizenry panel was held, and I think within the public there is still this fear-mongering going on, but it has to be given a fair calculation before starting this strategy on solar and wind. Right now, the renewable 3020 is mainly about solar and wind, and geothermal for the other side of the equation has been met with some setbacks during the Gyeongju earthquake. I mean, it hasn't been scientifically proven that it caused the earthquakes, but could have been a catalyst to the earthquakes. And in the United States, there is also studies from Ohio on this. Was it Oklahoma? Yeah, I think Ohio. And compared to geothermals, wind is an excellent choice, I think. But what I'm trying to ask is that enough? Yeah.
I know in Europe they've done extensive climate studies to see how much fluctuation you would get from solar versus how much you would get from wind.
Right, yeah.
Have the similar studies been done in Korea?
If you read Energy Policy and Renewable Energy, these are the stellar sort of academic/policy journals on energy, and the most quality-oriented research outcomes are published there. And I think through doing this paper, I think I've read through most of the South Korean cases, and on the wind, I don't think there has been substantial research that has been conducted in comparison to solar. I think much of the attraction is basically on solar because Hanwha Q-Cell is doing great, and was doing great. And on wind, there is still a lot of doubt, skepticism from the public in general. Would that be appropriate for South Korea? I think people would still question.
We still have some time. Don't listen to Siri.
I think it was Google Maps.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Mark Tokolov from KEI. I had two questions about solar panel production. So first, do companies that produce solar panels compete in terms of proprietary technologies or quality, or is every solar panel just like every other solar panel, and all that matters is production cost? And then second, are there inputs for producing solar panels that give some countries natural advantage? Is it labor or minerals or something else?
Minerals in terms of
What do you have to make a solar panel?
On that, I probably have to consult an engineer. But the first question, as to your first question, I think there are not many, as Kyle summed it up, there are not many solar industries that are like strong enough, such as the subsidized Chinese cases. But on the other hand, the quality is better than most Chinese cells. And of course, if you compare it to the Japanese cells, the story is a little bit different. I've talked with some Japanese energy experts about this, and the basic difference is that Japan doesn't really target the niche market of low-priced merchandise. And what they want to ensure is that, okay, if you buy the solar panel, it will stay in your home for a longer duration of time, and it will give you the supply that you need. I think Korean products at this point are at the middle of the Chinese offer and the Japanese offer. The up-and-coming Indian cells, I think, are at a similar quality as the Chinese panels, but they do persist for about a year and a half. And I think what the South Korean panels are suggesting is maybe a longer duration of maybe 5-6 years. And the efficiency of gathering the sunlight, I think South Korean firms that are trying to do more R&D on this are trying to develop methods that are most sort of optimizing the level of energy that can be absorbed. And for that reason, that's why I said in my policy regs that these have to be patented and they have to be globally marketed.
Jane Chu, working at Gavi. Thank you for sharing all the information and trends in South Korea about the solar panel. Does South Korea have some policy or regulations dealing with waste management of solar panel? If not, how they're dealing with those solar panels right now?
It's a very important question that you asked. Actually, your question is kind of tied into the final suggestion I made about the institutionalization of solar panel installation disputes and sort of the management of the panels. In one very interesting energy policy article written mainly by South Korean authors, there was a thorough case study on the kinds of like categories of disputes that occur amongst installers and the homeowners, and you have so many of these disputes that are on the rise, and if it also entails the abandonment, sort of throwing out of these solar panels, I think that in a system like South Korea, some central authority has to step in. For example, let me just give you an example. So I'm in the process of trying to relocate my parents to a new home, and 25 years since we left the United States, so many electronics in there, and they cannot function. In the Ministry of Environment, there is a service that collects these electronics. We do not know where they are headed, but they still provide a free service to pick up the electronics and distribute elsewhere. Washing machines are not included. Only TV, miscellaneous electronics, stereos, these kinds of things, hair dryers. But still, a central authority has to step in. Otherwise, what I'm witnessing right now is a deluge of all these trash coming out because everybody has to move out in the phase of reconstruction of apartment buildings all along the Han River. So I'm thinking the installation of solar panels always will come at a cost. It will always sort of have some kind of a dispute or abandonment, the throwing out of these panels. They're bound to be together, and there has to be a set of regulations that determine who has to pay for the cost of abandoning as the producer or the not producer, but the buyer or the installer, and who will collect the items. So it probably will fall upon the shoulders of the Ministry of Environment.
Does South Korea have the equivalent of our strategic petroleum reserve? The strategic petroleum reserve, which we put into place after the 1970s. Is this not working? Fine. Okay, is this better?
I think I understood the question, so it's okay.
Okay. All right, now it's better. Okay. Because from what I'm reading from the Middle East, I think we might be on the eve of repeating that in terms of the growing tensions, Iran, Israel, Saudi Arabia. Does South Korea have anything in place in case the energy is interrupted or the prices go up and there's increasing competition?
I think there are strategic reserves. It's just not frequently talked about in the news or discussed by the public because all the concentration is on Russian pipeline gas and nuclear energy and renewables. But oil is definitely there. And from what I've seen in my 1 year of living in South Korea this past year, there is continued supply coming in from the Middle East, but there is also increased supply coming from countries like Malaysia. Gas that doesn't really have to complement, people are open to other things now. It's not just about oil. So the strategic reserve as intended for in the days of the Arab-Israeli war, it doesn't really serve its purpose. Well, having it is important. And maintaining it is also important because oil is still a vital source of energy, but I'm thinking that the diversification process will occur more rapidly than we can actually imagine. And at the same time, South Korea is trying to go more toward doing business transactions with these traditional Gulf states, petrostates, to provide alternative sources of energy and to ensure that they can sell nuclear power technology to them. So, UAE was one of them. South Korea is in the running for the bid to build nuclear power plants in Saudi Arabia. This is another project that I'm doing with my Lebanese co-author, but there are 5 countries that are basically in the running. And, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, these countries can't just depend on oil anymore, and they know it. And they want to sort of diversify their energy sources. And right now for the Saudi Arabian bid, I think the US and Korea and the UAE want to sort of team together to pitch a proposal to the Saudis. The competition is coming from the French, Russians, and the Chinese. And I think we're encountering a completely different energy era in which oil is not everything. And that scares a lot of people because it used to be the norm and now it's not the norm. And of course, oil prices go up again. But as one of my favorite authors on energy, Bob McNally, notes, the oil market has always been a boom and bust, and it will continue to be a boom and bust. It's not just, at this end that we would see the decline of oil. It may rise again, and then it may fall again. So right now, at this important time in our era, I think oil is only one part of our energy construction proportion. And renewable energy is hot because people want to invest in it. It would always be like a volatile scheme going forward. And there would be a point in which oil is appreciated again.
Jacqueline Kaminsky. I would like to know if you are including in your studies and and if Korea itself is including in its plans and on its planning horizon the use or investment in and the future use of nuclear fusion power, fusion as opposed to fission, and fusion is not radioactive, does not pose the radioactive danger that fission does. The danger in fusion is the heat that's generated in the process. I just wondered if that's included in your thinking for long-term investment.
That would be something to unravel. So my Lebanese co-author, he's a physicist, nuclear physicist, so he may know more about this, but my research has mainly been more about the trans-regional transactions between the Gulf states and East Asian states, China, Japan, Korea, on oil and gas for renewables and nuclear. I haven't gotten into that detailed area. I honestly cannot say. I'm not quite well aware of the different technologies, but if South Korea is to deploy nuclear energy officially again, maybe not in this administration, but subsequent administrations, I think that energy efficiency and safety would be one of the most critical components to consider. And it's not that the South Koreans have not been doing that. It's just that it has been business as usual for some of the government agencies that deal with nuclear power. And as we've seen in Fukushima, what that can bring about is really catastrophic. So what you suggest is, I'm not quite well aware of the engineering differences, but if there is a safer way to deploy nuclear power, then I think South Korea should definitely consider it. And it would be an interesting venue of research, future research. Ah, okay. Oh, I see. Oh, I'll definitely mention that to my co-author.
Hi, my name's Charlie Vest. I'm with the National Bureau of Asian Research. My question is on forecasted power demand in South Korea and the economics of solar. So I'm particularly curious about whether or not future installations of solar will be satisfying future power demand or whether they'll be replacing decommissioned nuclear and coal.
So I think you're asking what's really at the crux of this study. Basically, I think what the government really sort of proposes is replacing, electricity generation with renewables. But if you think in everyday, present-day practices, that hasn't really come into being yet. And for example, on even the nuclear, over the past month or two, there was a massive heat wave in South Korea. And electricity supply, compared to previous years, was not really there. And the prices kept on just, sorry, not the prices, the supply, the usage kept on skyrocketing. Day by day, there was a new record. And I think in order to meet these demands, renewables could play a role in trying to sort of not replace, but supplement going forward. So there would be more and more demand. I'm not talking about demographic reasons. In the Middle East, it's more about demographic reasons. But in South Korea, I think climate change is one of them, like how to address these challenges. And the other thing is about how South Korea reconstructs its energy policy. So if it doesn't want to depend on oil and coal that much, then it has to think about other ways of not replacing, but more supplementing the material. And I don't see much of that in the current energy policy yet. It's mainly about just foregoing nuclear, basically. And that's where I see the blind spot.
Just as a quick follow-up, are there feed-in tariffs for solar in Korea?
That's what's proposed. As I mentioned in one of the slides, where was it? I think it was in this slide. Here. So the feed-in tariffs, they are envisioned, and we have yet to see the 30/20, not the action plan, but the actual report that comes out to say, the administration will actually do this. And then there would be an action of laws. That has not taken place yet, but that's proposed within the action plan. And the report was supposed to be released late last month, but I haven't seen it yet. Instead, I've seen news reports about, confusions about the nuclear power policy, what is the government actually doing with it, are some of these nuclear power plants actually in generation, and why? Because what the public is envisioning is basically like foregoing nuclear power at all costs. But that is not very realistic for South Korea at the moment, especially if it wants to export nuclear power technology.
I wanted to go back to the part of your presentation on the impact of the safeguards. I understood you to say or imply that the U.S. safeguards had a far more serious and negative impact on South Korea's solar industry than it did China's. Do you think that's a decisive and kind of irreversible thing? And kind of related to that, is it the perception in South Korea, either on the part of the government or more generally, that this is the case, that it was U.S. action that has kind of stopped the solar industry in its tracks?
So let me answer the second question first. I don't think it was only the safeguard that made the solar industry in Korea struggle. Basically, if you look at the Chinese case, the reason why they grew so big in such a short amount of time is because there were government subsidies. But Korea is kind of late in this game. If you look at other countries that have done solar energy development, they've had subsidies. I don't think the R&D subsidization is regulated at the WTO. However, if it wants to sort of go beyond, so the actual answer to your second question is that there was no government backing and companies had to strive to survive on their own. And because Korea is late in this game and, the safeguards, even if they are overturned, that would still mean that what China tries to do in response to the overturning would also be a factor. But even without the Chinese decision, I think South Korea is still pretty much marginalized in the global market. Of course, Hanwha Qcell could be the leading producer at one point, but it could easily be, falling back at any point in time. And this solar panel generating industry is fiercely competitive, and it is only going to be more competitive into the future. So there is no guarantee that even if the safeguard is lifted, of course, from the EU side, Chinese panels are now welcomed, but I'm thinking the European countries have had their share of developing panels already, and the Chinese goods would be just a supplement to it. What I'm worried about essentially is about preserving the South Korean developed technologies that could be beneficial in the longer term for the industry in general. So provide like a firm foundation just for solar, and other industries should do the same. But if solar energy is the way to go, and if it has met this big hurdle just because of the safeguard, in addition to all of the different factors involved, then it should think about what it has been doing wrong.
Thank you. Yano Kim, non-resident fellow at KEI. I have a question about your policy recommendations, specifically the diversification of export destination. I think that's one of the popular policy recommendations when it comes to overcoming any challenges coming from the U.S., I guess. But I remember that you suggested the Middle East could be one of the promising markets for, non-U.S. market for South Korea. But I wonder if South Korea, the solar industry is competitive enough and ready to penetrate the markets in the Middle East. Our recent memory is not that positive. Lee Myung-bak selling nuclear power plants to UAE. We found a lot of controversies followed up, and the most recent one was Park Geun-hye trying to help her close friend, plastic surgeon, trying to penetrate the Middle Eastern market. It didn't go well. So I guess when it comes to the markets in the Middle East, probably the people in the street in Korea would question the validity of that idea, no matter whether or not they have any technological knowledge on that.
When it comes to the Middle East, I think South Korea is surprisingly backward in many ways. The Middle East is a very attractive location to invest, despite all of the, adversities that come along with the security challenge. One of the things that you see as a very sort of source of differentiation among China, Japan, and South Korea in Middle Eastern markets is how bold they are and how large scale they are. South Korea has basically no sound expertise on the Middle East to begin with. You see here in Washington, there are so many people. And, it mainly has to do with sectarianism and security and all that, but there is also plenty of expertise on the energy markets in the Middle East. So what I'm concerned about going forward is if the Lee Myung-bak administration has failed in Iraq, it is not because Iraq is a bad place to invest. It's because Lee Myung-bak had the intent to sort of put everything in his own pocket. And the very basic example of this is in the investment in Iraqi Kurdistan. What happened there is that there were no, sort of from the Korea oil company side, KNOC side, there was no sufficient monitoring and critical study about Iraq central government and Kurdistan government with regard to their domestic dynamics. And when the ISIS defeat was completed, it's not thoroughly completed, but semi-completed, and Baghdad took over some of the fields, especially Kirkuk, South Korea was at a loss because the central government decided to deploy, central government of Iraq decided to deploy a tactic in which anybody, any entity that was involved in the Kurdistan government's projects would be sort of, they wouldn't be allowed to participate in the Baghdad government's projects. So South Korea completely misread Middle Eastern politics. And thinking about Saudi Arabia, thinking about UAE. So UAE was basically a competition between the French and the South Koreans, and both of them tried to deploy military force there, in exchange for securing the deal. But ultimately, what really came down to the decision, if you read the WikiLeaks, sort of the diplomatic courier that was sent to the U.S. embassy, is that the ultimate decision-making factor for the Emiratis was basically the fact that the South Koreans provided the taking care, so management and maintenance of the power plants, whereas the French did not. Both of them tried to secure the deal by supplying special forces. So I'm thinking, not only does South Korea lack considerable knowledge on the Middle East, but it has these weird ways of policy networking with the Middle Eastern countries in ways that is not very appreciated. China, for example, is also a very controversial actor right now in the Middle East. China is taking over sufficient amounts of oil fields that ExxonMobil tried to step out of, and it will become the major energy consumer from the Middle East by 2030. Now, if South Korea wants to keep on doing business with the Gulf states, it needs to provide something that China cannot, that Japan cannot. And in doing so, it has to think about a strategy to rear experts in the field of Middle East, not just regional studies, but about the political economy of the Middle East. I sense this in South Korea because I also work on the Middle East, and you just don't see people working on it, not from the religion angle, not from the anthropological angle, but just on the political economy angle, without any kind of bias on Islam or that's not the essential thing right now for South Korea. What's essential for South Korea is to conduct long-term engagements with the Middle East with sort of mutual kind of satisfaction, mutual delivery. And in that regard, I don't think that the Middle East should be disregarded from the whole perspective.
We have time for one last question. Oh, I'll give it to Sung-Yi. Raphael.
Hi, my name is Sung-Yi. I'm a commerce and energy researcher. I have a quick question about the utility market or electricity market in Korea. So I personally think that in order for solar or any solar power to thrive in South Korea is target residential sector. And as you mentioned, I think it's really important that residents get enough incentives such as feed-in tariff that Korea does not have. But I think there is a different mechanism that Korean government provides. But another problem with the solar markets in Korea is that the electricity market is deregulated. It's regulated. So in order for solar companies and smart grids to thrive, I think for small and medium enterprises is that you need some sort of open market, but currently there is no such thing. What are your thoughts on utility market in Korea, and what are some of the recommendations you have?
I think over the past few months, because of this heat wave, a lot of these media outlets in Korea have been trying to compare the utility markets of other countries and trying to see whether the system that Korea had at the moment was sound or rational or made sense at all. I've been to several energy seminars with some of these people from Korea Electric Company and basically from all sectors, so nuclear, oil, gas. Everybody is just trying to, fix some kind of an equation that really deals with the stable supply and the right cost. And in the middle, there are different entities that that are outsourced entities that try to kind of get a stake in the game. And when I see this in comparison with deregulated Japanese markets, especially in gas, the Japanese have plenty of choices to choose from, right? There is no absolute answer with regard to whether the privatization of electricity is good or bad. There are vices and virtues. But what's really clear at this point in South Korea is that sometimes the principles are not really fit to serve the public. And the public is left to sort of wonder why they have to pay this much and that much, and the price fluctuation is always there. In contrast, I've lived in different countries, and I think that, in Singapore and in Japan, I understood what I was paying for. And I would study it, right? And it would come at the end of every month. And In the US, of course, when I've lived in Virginia, it was massive during the winter, like $300. But still, I could have like a breakdown of what I was paying for, and if there was an intended increase, it would be notified. And it's something that I don't quite see sometimes in the South Korean way of policymaking. You have to really let your constituencies know what would be the decision and why they have to pay for this much. And if there is no consensus, they need to be transparent about why they decided to do so. I've witnessed in many, many utility market, electricity price market seminars in Korea that some of the sort of backdoor channeled ways of policymaking have not disappeared, especially with middle contractors that are in between, stuck in the contracts. And they're getting their share as well. So the ultimate provision is not based on complete economic calculation that one should expect as a citizen. And that would be like a critical thing to do going forward.
Thank you all for your questions, but most importantly, thank you to June. That was a fantastic handling of questions in the presentation. We're going to have a paper coming out in the next few weeks based off of her presentation, but as I'm sure many of you know, being in the early stages of your academic career, it's really tough, so we're working with June to get it out, but please bear with us as we will take a couple more weeks to get the paper out. But thank you, June, and please join me in thanking June and showing appreciation for her talk today.